Playing Kings, we're going to get rid of Solomon tonight in case, I hope, unless we get bogged down on something, uh, we'll get rid of Solomon and get this thing broken up. Next week will be the shorthand of the two kingdoms. At least half of it is easy. Not good, just easy, right? So we had last week Solomon opening up the temple, opening up his palace. His wisdom is becoming known. His wealth is becoming known. So in 1 Kings 10, story you probably know, Queen of Sheba shows up. And notice why she came, chapter 10, verse 1. She came to challenge him with difficult questions. Some people have supposed that maybe those were riddles, right? Who doesn't like a good riddle? Maybe it's a precursor to J.R.R. Tolkien and his little riddles in Lord of the Rings. But this is a big deal. I mean, think about where Israel's come from. A bunch of nomads, a country that's been established from people who fled Egypt. But now they're kind of center stage. Listen to how she arrives, verse 2. She arrived in Jerusalem with a great display of pomp, bringing with her camels, carrying spices, a large quantity of gold and precious gems. You know, one way to show off your wealth is to give part of it to someone else, but it also shows that she was honoring Solomon. And so there's probably some prestige here that Israel has never experienced before, quite like this as a country. So you think about it, there was probably a lot of pride in seeing, hey, look at this visiting queen and the gifts she's bringing. And to top it all off, Solomon delivers, right? When the Queen of Sheba saw her for herself Solomon's extensive wisdom, the palace he had built, the food in his banquet hall, his servants and attendants, their robes, his cupbearers, his burnt offerings, which he presented in the Lord's temple, she was amazed. And maybe the best translation is there, it took her breath away, right? This is not just like, oh, this is nice. This is overwhelming. I don't know if you've ever been to one of those places where you just go, I've never been anywhere like this. There's a hotel we've gone to in Dallas called the Hilton Anatole, and it's a huge place. It's like walking 8 or 9 football fields from one end to the other, and they have over 1,000 rooms. And you walk in, you look at the atrium, it's 8 or 9 stories high. And I always think about folks who drove in from, West Texas somewhere. Don't usually come to Dallas, and they walk in this hotel for our event, and it's like, got to be, wow. Well, did it to me, right? It is not the Motel 6. Yeah. Denise got a call one time, and the lady was asking questions about the Anatoly Motel. We knew she was going to be in for a rude awakening when she actually got there, because we didn't think her perspective was grand enough. They have an elephant that's probably 15 feet high at the entrance of one of the one of the big entrances into one of the big lobbies. It's just ornate, over the top. And so we get that, and here's this queen who obviously had lots, who kind of has that same reaction. Look at verse 6. The report I heard in my own country about your wise sayings and insight were true. She wasn't having it. She wasn't believing that this is all going to be as good as it was embellished. But she shows up and it's not. Now it's interesting to me, the list of things she's impressed by, and again, I may be reading too much in because I'm kind of reading between the lines. It doesn't say she's impressed with the temple. She's just impressed with all the burnt offerings that Solomon's offering. And maybe the temple too, but she seems to be taken with Solomon more than anything. And then as you read on there, we learn more and more from verse 7 through verse 17. There's one word that keeps jumping up, right? Gold, 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 gold. Just lots of gold.
In verse 4, it mentions she was impressed with the palace that he built and with the servants. It doesn't say the temple.
Right.
We talked last time
Yeah.
about the palace took twice as long to build as
Yeah.
the temple.
Yeah. We're getting our first hint, maybe, that Solomon has fully leaned into this king and all its benefits, right? Look at verse 18. The king made a large throne decorated with ivory and overlaid it with pure gold. There were 6 steps leading up to the throne, and on the back of it, rounded top, the throne had 2 armrests with a statue of lions standing on each side. There were 12 statues of lions on the 6 steps, 1 lion at each end of each step. And then this statement: there was nothing like it in any other kingdom. Verse 21, and continues. All of King Solomon's cups were made of gold. Right? I've been to some of your houses. You didn't serve me in gold cups. All the household items in the palace of the Lebanon forest, remember that's the palace's name, were made of pure gold. There were no silver items, for silver was not considered very valuable in Solomon's time. And if you notice then in verse 22, once every 3 years, the fleet came into port with cargoes of gold, silver, ivory, apes, peacocks. Think exotic, right? They're bringing back animals that nobody's ever seen before. They're bringing back riches and abundance. And in case we're missing the point, the writers tell us in verse 23, King Solomon was wealthier and wiser than any of the kings of the earth. So what's the problem with this? The temptation, king wasn't supposed to make himself wealthy, right? That wasn't the intent of power over other people so that you garnish wealth. And so I have a hard time knowing how to evaluate this, because another part of our thinking says, if you have wealth, then that means you're blessed by God. At least the way we think about it, right? So how do you argue with that? But you remember another item that the king was told not to have too many of, right? Was horses. And then it just continues. It's kind of like the writers took that list of things that you're not supposed to do and is telling us how Solomon did them. 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horses. The king made silver as plentiful in Jerusalem as stones. And I hadn't ever noticed this before, but look in verse 29. After he talks about buying horses and chariots from Egypt, It says they also sold chariots and horses to the king of the Hittites and the king of Syria. So again, we see in Solomon's wisdom, he knows how to buy wholesale and make a profit. He's an arms, in a sense, an arms dealer. And again, it might explain some of the wealth that's coming in to the country. Remember, they're at their largest area as a country, and I think took over some pretty lucrative routes of trade. And so you're going to benefit from that as a country. And then in chapter 11, we check the next box, right? King Solomon fell in love with many foreign women, besides Pharaoh's daughter, including Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonites, and Hittites. What is familiar about those names? And who are these guys? The Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, the Sidonians, and the Hittites. Yeah, because they're right there. They're neighbors is the word I'm trying to pull out, right? These aren't necessarily way off and foreign. These are the people right there.
According to the wisdom of the world, that's how you make peace around you. You go to all these other kingdoms, you get married, one from each kingdom.
Yeah. They came from nations about which the Lord had warned the Israelites, you must not establish friendly relations with them. So not even the idea the king wasn't supposed to have many wives. The country wasn't supposed to make these alliances with their neighbors that followed other gods, because here's the prohibition. If you do, they will surely shift your allegiance to their gods. So when we talk about Solomon, sometimes we use the word sin and we use it very broadly to think of mistakes that we make. There's a very specific idea here that I think the writers want us to see. The big sin of the king, among plenty others I'm sure, is where his heart, where his alliance was. Who did he rely on? And it's easy for us to outsmart ourselves, isn't it? To think we know so much that we're in some kind of control. And you see the numbers there, verse 3, 700 wives, 300 concubines. But here's the sentence in verse 4. The very thing that was concerning happens when Solomon became old. So it didn't just happen immediately, but over time he wore down. As Solomon became old, his wives shifted his allegiance to other gods. He was not wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord his God as his father David had been. Now, it doesn't mean he rejected Yahweh, but there's competing allegiance, competing trust. So one way to think when you hear the word David, you think whole heart for God. That's what he's known for. But his son Solomon, who was to carry on his kingdom, his moniker is half heart for God.
Through all this, we don't see Solomon getting a priest or prophet or anybody to be close to him and advise him and second guess him. There is no Nathan here.
It doesn't appear to be.
There's nobody to say, hey, remember how you were told not to do that? You were told not to intermarry with.
And what's the temptation? If you are the smartest guy, the wisest guy, do you need advisors? And the answer is yes, right? The answer is yes, because we can't see all things at all times. We can't see the perspectives. We all need people that help us see the other side of things, to see more than we're seeing. Just being the smartest doesn't give you all perspective. And we see why he's going to be half-heart for God, because it says he built up high places. He's built this great temple for Jehovah, for Yahweh. But guess what? He also builds for the Moabite god Chemosh, the Ammonite god Milcom. He built high places for all his foreign wives so they could burn incense and make sacrifices to their gods. So instead of him influencing them towards Jehovah, it has the opposite effect. And as you might expect, especially with expectations of what a king was supposed to do, how he was to lead the people spiritually, he wasn't just the military, he was a spiritual leader, or was supposed to be. God's response to him, starting in 11, because you insist on doing these things and have not kept the covenantal rules I gave you. And see, that's the sin. The sin is he's broken this covenant, this allegiance to God. I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. However, for your father's David's sake, I will not do this while you are alive. I just wish I could watch the movie of that. Did he relax? Did he go, oh, okay, it's coming later? Did he care? Did it prick him to the heart? Well, how did he respond? We're not told. But I will not tear away the entire kingdom. I will leave your son one tribe for my servant David's sake. Well, we also know there was something else at play there, right? We have the ability to look back. The future Messiah was coming through this lineage. But God wasn't going to, it didn't turn out like it could have, as God wanted it to or intended. So when we first started talking about Solomon, remember what one of his names meant. It meant peace. And for a long time, I think the kingdom has had peace. That's why they have prospered. But in the midst of this, we're going to see that's no longer true. So starting in verse 14. Right. They yeah. The Lord brought against Solomon an enemy, Hadad, the Edomite. What's interesting about that, you remember who the Edomites are? That's what? Not Lot's. You're in the right vicinity. Esau. Yeah. You're a little early, a little later. No, you're thinking right. These are relatives, right? These were Esau's kin. When Jacob returned, remember, Jacob and Esau actually made up. Jacob was afraid Esau wanted to kill him. But what did Esau do? He picked him up and hugged him and gave him a kiss and said, we're okay. But they continue to fight with the Edomites. And Joab almost extinguished, if you read through there, and you can read back to where this happened, almost killed all the Edomites, wiped them out, except for Hadad, who escaped off. He was just a small boy. He went to Egypt. I guess Egypt was the safest place because people keep going there. He hears that when Hadad hears that David's dead, he returns. And so he raises a ruckus and returns home. Then verse 23, God also brought against Solomon another enemy, Rezon. Verse 25 says, he was Israel's enemy throughout Solomon's reign, and like Hadad, caused trouble. He loathed Israel and ruled over Syria. As smart as Solomon was, as many alliances as that he made, to me has a much more political feel to things. And anytime you're pushing, anytime you're abusing any group of people, you're going to make enemies. And that certainly seems to be the case here. When the big guys fight, it causes troubles for the little guys. But eventually, enough little guys, what are they going to do? They're going to rise up. Then there's one more of note that we need to mention. That's Jeroboam. He works for Solomon, but he rebels against the king. And when he's out one day, he's a very talented man, the text says in verse 28. He's an accomplished worker. He's from the tribe of Joseph. He is an Ephraimite. The prophet Ahijah met him on the road, and the two of them were alone in open country. Ahijah was wearing a brand new robe, and he grabbed the robe and he tore it into 12 pieces. Take 10 pieces, for this is what the Lord God of Israel has said. Look, I'm about to tear the kingdom from Solomon's hand, and I give 10 tribes to you. This is a pretty important story. I think it's important to realize that because Solomon has not wholeheartedly followed God, he's going to lose a big part of the kingdom. And you know the history, the 10 northern tribes. There's two, really, Judah and I don't have a good understanding, and it may have simply just been geography, or there may be a different kind of alliance, why the Benjaminites kind of go with Judah. Maybe somebody has a clear insight, but that's going to be what happened. Always, Andy.
Actually, the city of Jerusalem was, like, I think, technically it's on the border between Judah and Benjamin.
Right. So that's why I was saying geography. And Benjamin's a southern tribe and kind of isolated from what we typically think of Israel being the northern tribes. So, yeah, it's right next to Jerusalem, and just geographically, maybe it made more sense. Okay. Right. Well, David was from the tribe of Judah. Right? Yeah, I think he...
It's just in Hebrews, when the Hebrews writer's making the point that Jesus is a different kind of priest, and he says he's not even a Levite, he's from the tribe of Judah.
Lion of Judah.
At that point, Judah and Benjamin would be considered Judah. But it's like two tribes merged into one.
Well, and it's hard for us. I like where you're going with that, because it's really hard for us. We think of them as very distinct, but you know how kids are, right? They don't necessarily marry who they're supposed to marry. And you know it was okay to marry people from other tribes. By this time in Israel history, tribes had intermarried. You know, they didn't just marry within their tribe, they married within Israel. And yeah, I think there's probably a lot more mixing of the tribes than we kind of understand.
These are the people that weren't supposed to marry, because the worship the gods
Well, no, the Benjamites were. Right, I'm not talking about the Edomites. I'm talking about the Benjamites and the tribe of Judah. Yeah. No, you're right. They weren't supposed to intermarry with these other neighbors, even the Edomites. Yeah. So let's get back to Jeroboam. He's told he's going to get part of the kingdom, but it's the same deal. What is God asking of Jeroboam? Look at verse 37. I will select you. You will rule over all you desire to have, and you will be king over Israel. You must obey all I command you to do, follow my instructions, do what I approve, and keep my rules and commandments as my servant David did. What's he asking Jeroboam? Have a whole heart towards me. Be all in. Then I will be with you and establish for you a lasting dynasty as I did for David. I will give you Israel. You'd think that sounds like a pretty promising idea. Solomon doesn't like it. Verse 40, he tries to kill Jeroboam, but he escapes, of all places, Egypt, and he stays there until Solomon dies. So, as strong as Solomon was, as wealthy, he's losing his way over time. He's allowing other influences to pull him away, and whether it's just to keep these wives happy, maybe, I don't know. He does things for them just like he did in building the temple. But as we knew would happen, Solomon's time comes to an end. Verse 41, the rest of the events of Solomon's reign, including all of his accomplishments and his wise decisions, are recorded in the scroll called the Annals of Solomon. Solomon ruled over all Israel from Jerusalem for 40 years. So if he was 16, 17, he's not an old man, right? He's younger than maybe all the men here except Andy. Right? You're getting pretty close to that, right? Okay. We just call all the men. Okay. But he passes away. We're not told why or where, but he does have a son, Rehoboam. Now, I don't know what your opinion of having two major characters whose names rhyme and they're at the same time. It's not. I don't think it's quite as bad as Elisha and Elijah being at the same time because they start with the same thing. It's harder to keep them straight. But do you ever mix up Jeroboam and Rehoboam and try to remember? Okay. I taught 7th graders for a long time, and I wanted them to remember, so I tried to help them. And here's what I came up with. Rehoboam is a repeat of Solomon. That's all I got. Sorry. But it helps. I don't get them mixed up anymore. Rehoboam is Solomon's son. He's a repeat. So the joke goes like this. Jeroboam and Rehoboam were sitting on a fence. Jeroboam fell off. Who was left? Rehoboam. Y'all know that joke, right? Pete and Repeat were sitting on a fence. Pete fell off. Who was left? Pete and Repeat were... Okay, sorry. Maybe that's an Oklahoma joke. Maybe that's my heritage from long ago, but I cannot remember a time in my life I didn't know that joke. So it's been around a while. That's how it sticks in my mind, because it is important to keep people straight. And we're about to enter a bad stretch. Because there's going to be a northern kingdom, there's going to be a southern kingdom. We've had an absence of prophets, but a bunch of them are going to start showing up. And until the northern kingdom goes away, it stays a little complicated. So I try to find everything I can get to help me. And it's important to think about Rehoboam as a repeat of Solomon, except maybe even more so. Now, it is evident to me that Rehoboam does not share his father's wisdom, and we're going to get into that. But I want to interlude here Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 18 and 19. I don't know, these words are attributed to Solomon, and I don't know where at in his lifespan he penned these words, but I'm going to think it was later on as he was thinking about, I'm not going to be here forever, and somebody's going to take, one of my sons is going to take my place. This is what he says, Ecclesiastes 2:18. So I loathed all the fruit of my effort, from which I worked so hard on the earth. I mean, one thing about Solomon, he got a lot done. He built a lot. Why did he loathe this fruit of his effort? Because I must leave it behind in the hands of my successor. Okay, I've done all this work, but I'm leaving it. Who knows if he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet, doesn't matter if he's a wise man or a fool, yet he will be master over all the fruit of my labor, for which I worked so wisely on the earth. This also is futile. Yeah. It's a great question. What are we building? What are we leaving? How are we leaving it? If Solomon had built a great name for himself, that doesn't guarantee that stands after he's gone. It's very important for us to think about what we're leaving. And now we've had 2 kings in a row, right? David, Solomon, and I think everybody, starting in 1 Kings 12, is on board who should be the next king. Well, son of Solomon, right? We got a dynasty going here. Solomon was the greatest king we ever had. Let's keep going. Rehoboam traveled to Shechem, for all Israel had gathered in Shechem to make Rehoboam king. I mean, that was the plan. That's what was going to happen. When Jeroboam heard the news, he was still in Egypt. So again, he didn't get on a plane. All of this took some while to unfold. But Jeroboam, who had fled Solomon, they sent for him, meaning the people, and Jeroboam and the whole Israelite assembly came to Rehoboam, saying, they have a proposal. Your father made us work too hard. And for whatever reason, Solomon had the ability to do that. He pushed the people. There was a lot of wealth, but they said, we need you to lighten up. Your father made us work too hard. Now, if you lighten the demands, they didn't say stop, right? They said lighten the demands, and don't make us work as hard, we will serve you. And Rehoboam, at least listen, go away for 3 days, and I'll give you an answer. So he talks to the older advisors, starting verse 6. And I think in verse 7 is the key, and it is a wise understanding of what I was trying to paint last week. And I think most kings miss this, but the ones, if any of them understand it, this is what they were supposed to do. In verse 7, the older advisors say, today, if you will be a servant to these people. Now, that's not a word we often hear with king, but these older guys at least understood that was the role God intended when he said, not many wives, not many horses, not much gold, make your own copy of the law, right? The role of king is to serve the people. We have that in our vocabulary, right? Our government's at the best when it's serving the people. There's some things that have to be done for common good, and government can often supply that. I think that's what these older guys are asking. If you see your role as serving the common good of the people, we're all benefiting. We're all blessed by that. But Rehoboam, in all his wisdom, rejected their advice and consulted the young advisors who served him, with whom he had grown up. What, Jeff? She certainly may not have been. We're not. Yeah, that's a great point. And I kind of skipped over that a while ago. We didn't know which of these. He had 1,000 wives. How many sons did he have? Right? You would think more than one. Just the odds of that. But Rehoboam's the only one that's put forward, the only one we know about.
Modern meaning a few centuries.
Right? Mm-hmm. Well, because of the influence of his mother and grandmother.
He learned the scriptures from his mother, but he wasn't
Yeah.
circumcised.
Jeff, I think, no. Thank you. Yeah. 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 My guess would be yes, but there's no proof of that because if raised in the palace, you would think they would have, because it wasn't other customs to the exclusion, right? Solomon was more, we'll do all these things, right? So I think it's probably certainly possible, but I think he probably would have been circumcised like any male born to a Jew, much less the king, right? Because Solomon didn't abandon going to the temple and offering sacrifices. He just did it other places too. So it's more, we're going to do a little bit of all of this. Yeah. Well, when you start being successful by being political, when do you stop, right? If we only make decisions by popular vote or politically expedient, to me that just gets very hard. And there's a difference in American politics, right? We are not the people of God as much as some people would want to say we are, right? We were not the nation called like Israel to be a religious nation in the name of Yahweh. Now, I certainly know and appreciate that we're built with Christian principles in mind, but we are not the modern day Israel. There's one Israel. And leaders and countries and ways of living are going to come and go. Our job as the church in this world is to reflect the Father. And somewhere along the way, between David and Solomon, that already begins to slip away, and we get to Rehoboam. So, Jeff, thank you for that comment, because you think about it now, Rehoboam may have had less Jewish influence, right? If his mother, just speculating, if his mother was an Ammonite, is that what you said? Yeah. If princesses influenced Solomon, do you think they would have held influence over their own children? And notice that Rehoboam's going to listen to the people he grew up with. I always like doing this with teenagers, because I'm like, if you only ask other teenagers, you're going to get the answer you're wanting to hear, because they think just like you. If you ask people who are at the same stage of life as you, you're probably going to get the answers you think. I always think people that are a couple of steps ahead of me, that's who I need to be listening to, right? Learning from. They've been far enough further down the road from me, they have some perspective. But he's not going to do that. Verse, come on.
Was there ever, I'm missing this, but I don't know if there was ever a mention of Solomon marrying someone who wasn't.
Right, we don't have any mention of him marrying a Jewish girl. That would be amazing. I never thought of that, Clark. That's a good conversation. We're going to end on this phrase tonight, because Rehoboam gets to answer, and then we'll see the consequences of this next week. When he's asked whether you're going to let up, his response to them in the middle of verse 10, I am a lot harsher than my father. Now, your version may say, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. The Hebrew doesn't say finger. It just says my little is bigger than the waist. But we certainly get the picture, right? If this is my dad, this is me, right? You ain't seen nothing yet, I would believe would be the modern phrase. Which we immediately know that Rehoboam lacks in wisdom. Because part of what happened with Solomon is he built up that reputation when he was young, and his influence grew. Rehoboam, it appears, expects to step into that without building any trust or confidence. He's depending on the position, the title, the name, being king. I get to do what I want. And that is not going to be the case. So here's the thing with especially this part until we get into the divided kingdom and everything that happens, is there's a lot to learn from Solomon, a lot that I take away from. Am I whole heart for God? Am I half heart for God? What can I learn from the experience of another person? What things do I chase after, want, desire that get in my way of being the servant that God wants me to be? And it's no surprise to me that in Israel, when the king can't figure that out, it's going to be difficult for the rest of the people, because he kind of sets the tone, right? That's why leaders are important, who you follow, who you listen to, what voices you hear. All of that matters. Hope you have a good week.